GMO crops mean that we can use less pesticides to grow them?
Okay, you can, yeah. No.
Yeah, again, there's an element of comedy there, which is that why would chemical companies who survive solely on selling chemicals invent a technology that would mean less chemicals? That doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make any sense to their bottom line. Here's where the confusion lies. The vast majority, well over 90% of all GMO crops are either HT or BT. HT means herbicide tolerant. We described those briefly. That means that normally if you spray herbicide on your crops, it kills the crops, not just the weeds. They put a little piece of DNA from bacteria, actually, into your corn and your soy, and that means when you can aerial spray it, use a huge more amount of your herbicide, Roundup and others, the other companies make, and it doesn't kill the corn, kills the weeds, saturates the corn. You have huge more residues of these horrible chemicals in your food and in your kids' bodies, but it doesn't kill them outright. So that's herbicide tolerant, and that massively increases the use of herbicide and increases the bottom line. The other technology they put on the market is something called BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, and this is a bacteria that's a non-chemical insecticide. And that primarily went into corn, and this was their claim to altruism. The idea was if we use a lot of this BT, that is going to kill the corn borer, let's say, and that way we'll have to use less of the harmful chemical insecticides. And indeed that was true, actually, to give them their due, for the first year or two. But unfortunately, what was happening, and what is happening now, and is actually almost completely finished now, is that the insects that would eat the plant that had this BT in every one of its cells would not eat enough to kill the insect. And by doing so, you were basically vaccinating the insect to not be able to be killed by the BT and then its offspring. In other words, adaptation. And we know this same thing happened to the weeds. They're now super weeds. You can't kill them with Roundup. So this is third grade science, and they should have known it. And the real tragedy of that, as far as the BT, is that BT is a really important tool for organic farmers because it's a non-chemical insecticide. But now, because of the massive 24/7 use of this BT in these GMO crops, insects have developed resistance all across the country to a number of different versions of this BT bacteria. So it no longer actually is helping with reducing insecticides. It's actually, they're using BT and all these other insecticides on top of it. This is even USDA data shows it. So with HT, the entire technology is based on using hundreds of millions of more pounds of Roundup, and now 2,4-D, which is an element of Agent Orange, and now dicamba, up to 1 billion more pounds in the next 5 to 6 years, unless we stop it through our lawsuits. And on the other side, their altruistic thing turned out to take away from organic farmers one of the few non-chemical insecticide alternatives they had, and now we're actually seeing, once again, a major increase in these insecticides. So that, sorry to be a little bit long-winded there, but that's the answer that I have to that question.
I would just add to, sorry, I just want to add to what Andy just said, and I think that's, he's got very good points. And then I would actually add another lens to this question, because I just came from Iowa, actually, just like a week and a half ago. And what was interesting about Iowa, number one, is one of the centers of GMO production in Iowa. And one of the phenomenon that's happening because of repeated growing of monocultures is, which are encouraged by the commodity economy that Mckay just explained. Iowa, of course, one of the centers of the commodity economy, huge, vast fields of corn and soybeans sold into commodity markets. And one impact is the depletion of the nutrients that are in the soil. Most of that is GMO in Iowa. As a result of this repeated growth, you have the depletion of nutrients in the soil. What that means is that you need to have increasing quantities of chemical fertilizer that go into the soil in order to sustain these crops. And one major implication of this situation is that you have runoff of that of those nutrients, of nitrogen-based nutrients, that run off into the water supply. And guess what else happens in the water supply besides nourishing farms? People drink water. So the rivers, for example, the Des Moines River and the Raccoon River, where I was just a week and a half ago, frozen solid, incredibly stark and beautiful landscape of kind of tundra-like Iowa in the middle of January, frozen over all those corn and soybean fields. But meanwhile, from the ice drips, the steady drops of nitrogen that are actually entering into the water supplies of Des Moines and further cities further south, and ending up, of course, in the Gulf of Mexico in this big dead zone, which people have probably heard about. A lot, Iowa's number 1 or number 2, depending on which year you're talking about, contributed to that dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So just further elaboration on this question is, as Andy described, the pesticide impacts, and 2, the impacts of the fertilizers that are required in order to grow these kind of vast fields of
I think
GMOs.
I would like to add that Andy mentioned that there is a reduction initially of the insecticide use on the BT crops. But that's only if you count the applied insecticide spray. There are insecticides produced inside the crop, the Bt toxin. And different crops produce different quantities of Bt toxin. And Charles Benbrook and others evaluated how much Bt was being produced per acre compared to how much insecticide was saved per acre. And it turns out there's far more insecticide in the Bt crops than there is in the crops that are non-Bt and sprayed. In one case, the amount of Bt is as much as 12 times the amount that it replaces, that it reduces in terms of the spray. In addition, the Bt is applied to the seeds that's produced in the crops to kill the corn rootworm. But it doesn't develop so quickly. And so the plant remains exposed for the first few weeks. And so one thing that they do is they coat the seeds in a time-released neonicotinoid insecticide. And that, if you add the neonicotinoids plus the Bt, plus whatever they spray, it's certainly more than it displaces in the spray form. And the neonicotinoids are part of the package that causes colony collapse disorder. But also it is likely that glyphosate and Roundup are major contributors to colony collapse disorder. Most people don't know that, but there's a lot of evidence now that it is a major component because the neonicotinoids do not explain the full colony collapse disorder symptoms.
There were a group of honest scientists, I'd say,
Where? Sorry.
who were contemplating methods of reducing the enormous amount of synthetic pesticides and herbicides. Of course, the simple answer is, go organic. But they were trying to figure out how they can do this in a highly industrialized setting. And one of the ideas was, if you could take these proteins that exist in certain plants that the insects don't like to be around, and they're called lectins. They're insecticidal proteins. And if you can somehow put them in a crop that you like, and if you can grow the crop with these lectins, then the insects won't want to go near them because, who knows, the smell of the protein, the taste of it, they'll just walk away. That was the concept. And a few, I thought, honest scientists said, well, maybe it'll work. And one of them actually tried it, and he put the lectins from a flower into the potato, and he tested it, and it resulted in very damaged rodents. And he published the paper, and he said he wouldn't eat these potatoes. Now, there is a tradition that has gone back for millennia on taking flowers and planting them next to your potatoes in different rows. So you create a very diverse planting regime. And if you know that the bugs don't like these lectins in these plants, then you plant them near the potatoes. And that has worked. That's called agroecology, using the natural systems. But again, the scientists thought they could somehow figure out an end run around nature by pulling the proteins out of the plants and trying to make a consumable product have all the properties that it takes many plants to have. Sort of like getting the perfect instrument that starts your car, does your email, does everything in one small little instrument. Usually it'll fail. So anyway, that hasn't worked. But there have been people trying to figure out how to reduce the enormous amount of pesticides that currently is being used in the world. And many of these pesticides and herbicides have not been adequately tested, and they are carcinogens or endocrine disruptors, but we're still using them. So, but this system that by putting it into the plants so far has not worked, and it's not likely to work.